to Theories of Reality. I'm Professor Barberdale, and we're beginning on arguments for the existence of God today. So we'll be talking about three of the major traditional philosophical arguments for God's existence: the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument, or the argument from design. I think one thing to think about in these arguments for God's existence. But before that, I just want to add a couple announcements. The deadline to drop or change your grading option to pass, no pass is Friday, 5 p.m. Make sure to be aware of that for that in your other classes. And they're doing workshops throughout the week on how to make those decisions if you're in doubt. If you have any question about your grade, feel free to talk to me about that. And and for your other classes as well, make sure you've made all those decisions by the deadline Friday at 5. Also, the extra credit exam is open, and you can have through Friday of week 10 to take that. And that will cover material from both the first and second midterm exam. If you want to go over any of that stuff with me in my office, feel free to come by and we can do some reviewing before you take that. Okay, let's talk about these arguments for God's existence. So, one thing to think about God's existence, first of all, whether there is a God or not, does not depend on what you personally believe. God's existence is a matter of fact or not, right? So either God exists or God doesn't exist. It doesn't depend on your subjective mental state any more than whether anything else exists depends on your subjective mental state, right? So the world doesn't care about your feelings, right? So and you can feel a certain way or believe a certain thing. I can believe, I'm going to take something silly that's obviously false. Uncontroversially false. That's always difficult to do. So let's see. Trying to think of something in the news. School shootings, I guess. I could here we go. I could believe that an AR-15 is a automatic weapon. I would be wrong. Doesn't matter how firmly I believe it. My belief is factually incorrect. It's a semi-automatic weapon, which means you have to, each time you fire, you got to pull the trigger. Fully automatic weapon, you just pull down the trigger and it sprays bullets. So it doesn't matter how fervently I believe it. It's if the facts are otherwise, then I'm just wrong, right? This goes back to week 1 when we talked about the truth is corresponds with reality. A belief is true if it matches up with reality. It's false if it doesn't. And so God's existence is either a part of reality or it isn't. So if you believe God exists, that doesn't make God exist. God exists whether you believe in him or not. And it doesn't matter how strongly you believe in God. If there is no God, your belief is just false. So it doesn't depend on what you personally believe. It doesn't depend on the level of faith or the absence of faith you have. It's a matter of the objective evidence, right? So how we figure out whether something exists or doesn't exist, whether something's true or false, evidence, right? So we need evidence, arguments, empirical evidence, philosophical and logical arguments, and we'll look at all those in these arguments for God's existence. In the Middle Ages, there emerged this branch of theology called natural theology, and sometimes it's called philosophical theology. So this is the idea that in addition to knowing God through experience or through faith, there's also knowing God through reason. And so people starting out with, I suppose they start out with the church fathers, but the people that developed this most, St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, both developed this idea that you could know certain things about God without revelation, that is through the Bible and church tradition. So they're working in a Christian framework, and they had this idea, well, we know all these things about God through God's word, the Holy Scriptures, and through what the church teaches us in tradition that's separate from the Bible. But there are certain things that even the pagans know, and the Muslims and Jews, they can know certain things about God too, apart from Christian revelation. And so you get the emergence of natural theology, and this idea is using reason to know God. So the idea is that without hearing anything about the gospel of Jesus, just thinking about the universe, thinking about its character, nature, or even just thinking about the concept, the abstract concept of God, you can discover his existence and certain qualities about him. This is totally different from biblical theology, which is taking the Bible as God's revelation and going through it and trying to figure out what it teaches. So that's a totally different thing. But the natural theology, so when people say theology, the question is, are you talking about interpreting scriptures? That's, biblical theology. Or there's also, other religions. You can have textual text-based theology in Hinduism and Buddhism. But if you're talking about theology in terms of natural theology, it's really philosophy. And so you're talking about medieval philosophy and natural theology. It's philosophy of religion or philosophical theology. Okay, so I guess that's any questions about that? Questions, disputations about whether God's existence or non-existence is an objective fact or not? Or any questions about that?
St. Thomas Aquinas a Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Everybody's pretty much a Catholic until the Reformation, at least in Europe. Anselm is too. People, this is like something that people seem to sometimes they'll balk at this idea that the existence of God is something that you should use reason and evidence for, and it's either God either exists or he doesn't, and it doesn't depend on your subjective beliefs. And this is usually something when people are tempted by relativism, it seems like these are things that usually pop up, right? People say, well, how do you even know whether God exists or not? Or they say, well, I know about you, but God exists to me, right? And that's that. It's tempting to think in those ways. And I think the reason people revert back to this true for you, true for me, sort of thinking is that it's really hard to tell. Like the evidence seems kind of, it seems inconclusive. And there's widespread disagreement, yeah.
Well, and people just want a foundation, I mean, if someone's whole belief in God is being kind of shut down by someone, they're just going to resort to saying, well, I believe in it, so it's true, because it's a big foundation to rest your whole being on. And so if that's ever confronted, you kind of get afraid and you don't want to listen to anything else.
And it is true that like if you have a belief challenge that's really important to you, it's the tendency that people do is to sort of retreat and say, well, this is what's true for me.
Yeah. People
also do the other thing, like if someone like a person of faith is trying to convince you, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, Savior of mankind, and you say, oh, it's really nice that works for you, and I'm glad your faith means so much to you, but it's not for me. Just like, yeah.
Well, again, with the foundation thing, the problem is our reality seemingly doesn't have a foundation. It doesn't have like a purpose. We're always trying to search for this purpose of reality or whatever it is, but there isn't anything. And that's why I feel like religion has become so popular, because it shows, okay, well, this is a base of reality, and you can base your whole life off this in reality.
Mm-hmm. And that
to give outcome.
Sure, and religion forms like a basis of a lot of people's lives and of civilizations, and so that it has that like sociological role. So here's the idea. So think about, it could be the case that like Christianity, or if you like the Judeo-Christian tradition, is the bedrock of Western civilization and a basis for our laws and moral system, that's completely consistent with the idea there is no God, right? So you could say, well, God plays this social role, this sociological role, this role in this role in morality, but it turns out that he doesn't exist after all, and people are just wrong. But sometimes there are useful fictions, right? So sometimes a false belief can serve a useful social purpose.
And that's
So-
probably why it's said that there was a statistic about people being successful or either happy, and it was a large majority
Mhm.
that was religious.
Yeah, overall, on average, if you have a strong, and not just like a nominal belief, but you have like a real religious belief, and you attend religious services regularly, you're more likely to be you're likely to be healthier, happier, make more money, even be better educated, have fewer social and psychological problems. Yeah,
I kind of have this like weird theory about
live longer,
about religion. On
better
how
marriage.
When you pray, it actually does the same effect to your brain as meditation does. So if people that are very devout Christians pray a lot, their life seemingly gets better. They're in better attitudes. Things are more easier for them to understand. Life seems all of a sudden better now that they're praying all the time. I feel like
So
that might be an illusion of just actually meditating.
Yeah, and that's just like there are. This is why you can't settle questions about whether God exists or not just based on like perceived benefit.
Yeah.
Right. So, and there's always going to be psychological explanations for why religious people tend to be doing better. It's because of the power of belief. So what we want to do is try to figure out, well, is there any objective evidence for the existence of God? Quite apart from like the feelings that people get from their religion, the how they feel fulfilled, whether it gives them a sense of purpose or meaning. Ask this question, well, is there any objective evidence that could give rational justification for belief in God? So the first argument we're going to look at is the ontological argument. And so in the reading there, you might have noticed that it's in the form of prayer. St. Anselm says, oh, thank you, O Lord, that your existence is so plain and evident that even just by thinking about your very essence and nature, we see that you exist. And he quotes one of the Psalms. So there's a psalm in the Bible that says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And Anselm says the man truly is a fool because he's actually said something which is contradictory. So he says that if you think about the concept of God hard enough, you see that God has to exist, and that he can't possibly not exist. So Anselm says the guy that says there is no God, he really is a fool, and that he believes a contradiction, which can't possibly be true. So his argument is that God exists by definition, and that's what's called an a priori argument. So in epistemology, which is theory of knowledge, there are two kinds of statements, a priori and a posteriori. These are both from Latin words meaning a priori, prior to experience, and then a posteriori, after experience. And so an a priori belief is a belief that you have before examining the evidence. So and sometimes a priori beliefs are described as conceptual beliefs or logical beliefs that don't depend on the senses, right? So an a posteriori belief is an evidence based on the senses.
What do you mean?
So like I'll give an example, like if someone says, there are many roads to God, right? So people often say that. And you think, well, my usual response is, well, what's the evidence for that? and it's not as this person looked at and saw like there are all these different roads to God, it's usually not put as an empirical claim. Like, well, it's obvious there are lots of different religions, right? But when people say there are many roads to God, what they really mean is there are many equally valid paths to God, and it doesn't really matter which one you take. And you say, well, what's your evidence for that? And they just think it's obvious. It's like an a priori belief. Before examining the details of the different religions and seeing whether each and every path is a valid path and no path is any more effective or better than another path, they say, oh, there are many roads to God, and
Okay.
take your pick, right? It's a priori.
So the a priori is
A posteriori would be the opposite, when you'd analyze
Oh,
the details and try to figure out, okay, well, gee, the Church of Satan, maybe not so good.
Gotcha.
Or maybe pick on anybody, right? But maybe Scientology turns out to be a sham started by a sci-fi writer. Maybe that's not that good. Or maybe you might discover like that's a particular religion was started out by like a con man who was convicted of fraud, and then made unverified claims of revelation from God. So you can examine these the claims empirically, or through the senses. That's an a posteriori statement. So a priori, here's an example. Another one, like if you say something like, well, let's try like a good. You say the media. Most reporters are liberal, so you'd expect the media to be liberal. People that go into journalism, they're kind of idealistic. They want to change the world, and so they write about things they care about. Journalists don't make a lot of money, right? And so people that go into journalism are tend to be liberal. That's what you would expect, right? Now they don't they're not citing any studies of journalists or the attitudes of journalists. They're just thinking about the concept of a journalist. Who goes into journalism, right? Is it a person that wants to make a lot of money? Is it a person that wants to spread their religion? Is it a person that cares a lot about faith and family? Is it a person who's going to be conservative and focused on keeping things the way they are? No, it's a person who's somewhat idealistic, that likes to express their point of view and wants to change the world. Now, that's an a priori belief, because they're not pointing to any evidence like studies of the attitudes of journalism, analysis of like stories written by in the mainstream media to see whether they tilt liberal or conservative, right? So that's an a priori argument, because it's conceptual. It's based on the concept of the journalist. The type of person who goes into journalism is going to be liberal, so therefore you'd expect the media to be liberal. Now, an a posteriori approach to that would be like just to look at stories and see, like, for example, whether where the economy is exactly the same or pretty close, or some aspect of it. Like if you look at what people said about, say, the employment rate when Bush was president compared to when Obama was president. As it turns out, when unemployment is low, you get negative stories about unemployment in the Bush presidency more often than you see them for the Obama presidency. Or you look at just positive and negative coverage in the last election. So how many positive stories covering, say, Trump versus Hillary, right? And you can see, there's ways of looking at keywords, or looking at a story, whether it's positive or negative, critical, positive or neutral, right? And you can just count up the stories and come up with like objective empirical markers that shows that the media is pretty liberal, right? So, but that's different than this a priori. This is a priori argument, which just thinks about in terms of concepts, like what kind of person becomes a reporter. Oh, so then what kind of institution is journalism? Versus looking at, okay, well, let's look at these stories and see whether they tilt liberal or conservative. Let's do some investigation. Let's use our senses and try to figure it out based on the evidence, right? So then these two kinds of arguments you see all over philosophy, sometimes combined, but usually if you look at an argument, you can figure out, is this a conceptual argument based on ideas and concepts, or is this an argument based on evidence of the senses, which means scientific studies, empirical surveys, those sorts of things. And you can make an a priori argument on the other way around too. You could say, well, news organizations are businesses, maybe apart from NPR, and even NPR is, 90% supported by private money.
Really?
Yeah. Now they've whittled away their government support.
That's good.
Maybe it'll go to zero someday. Who knows? But most news organizations are for-profit agencies. So you could say, as such, you'd expect them to tell conservative, right? Conservatives love business and they love capitalism, and so you'd expect these big media giants and news organizations tend to be large corporations. So you'd say, well, you'd expect them therefore to give conservative coverage and to be pro-business and pro-Republican. It turns out that's a really bad a priori argument. And strangely enough, I guess corporations usually are focused on their narrow bottom line and they're trying to compete. But there's also like the ideological content that investors, the board members, the money people really don't pay much attention to that. They leave it to the managing editors and rank and file reporters who tend to be liberal. And there's a little bit of jockeying for position there, but anyway, you get the idea. So you can a priori argument is a conceptual argument. A posteriori is just based on evidence of the senses. And so Anselm's argument here, one of the big three, is the only concept that's really its only argument is really a conceptual argument, and it's based on this idea: if you think about the concept of God hard enough, you'll see that he has to exist. Okay, so we're going to first look at Descartes' version. Even though Descartes' version comes afterward, it's a little simpler, so I thought we'd start out with this. Descartes still sort of, he's a rationalist philosopher. He's kind of got one foot in the Middle Ages, another foot in the modern period. He's considered to be the first modern philosopher. The modern period started out with Descartes in the 16th century. So his argument is God is it starts out saying what do we mean by the word God? And Descartes' definition of God is of a perfect being. So when you think about what does the word God mean, and he thinks, well, God is this being that's perfect in every way. And that's sort of the essence of God is God is perfection. So then the question is, what does that imply, right? So you have the definition of God as a perfect being. What does that imply? Well, a perfect being has to contain all perfections. Now, what does that mean? Well, it just means that, what if you think about the concept of God and you ask the question, does God make mistakes? Could God tell a lie? Is God caught unawares about things? And you think, well, no, God's got to be perfect in every way. So what does he have? Well, he's all-knowing and doesn't. He's can do anything. He's all-powerful. He's the ground of morality. He's good in every way. So now, what if God had an imperfection, right? Then it seems like he really wouldn't be God. So God can have what? Think of, this is a great vastly underrated movie, Star Trek V, where they actually go looking for God and think they found him, and he's this disembodied ghostly head with a long white beard, and he's behind this great rift, and Spock's brother or half brother Sybok is there, and it's sort of a prophet of this God. And then he says, "Okay, let me take me aboard your starship, and we'll, together we'll convert the galaxy." And then Captain Kirk says, "Just one question: why does God need a starship?" And and then there's a lot of bluster and "How dare you question me?" And he starts zapping, zapping him with a lightning bolt, and And it turns out it's just like an alien masquerading as God who's been, you know, put into this sort of cosmic prison and is looking for people to bust him out so he can wreak havoc in the universe. So the idea is that, how do you know that's not really God? Well, because he's not really all powerful, right? He's got this flaw in that he's like in prison and can't bust out. Well, if he really was God, he'd be able to bust through any barrier, right? So the idea is that if you have, and you think about like anything you'd say would be perfect, like the perfect car, right? So if I have the perfect car and, you know, it's a hot, sticky summer, I'm looking to buy the perfect car, and it's got, you know, like an awesome stereo system, and it's got like a really sleek body and maybe some racing stripes and whatever, and it's a really smooth ride, but it doesn't have air conditioning. It's especially, you know, if you're in hot, someplace with the warm climate, that's not really the perfect car if it doesn't even have air conditioning, right? So one flaw means that thing's not perfect anymore. But God is the essence of perfection. He's a perfect being. So then Descartes asks the question, well, what about existence? And Descartes says it's obviously more perfect to exist than not to exist. So existence is a perfection. And so God as a perfect being would have to contain all perfections, including the perfection of existence. Therefore, God must exist in reality.
What way is existence
Yeah.
perfection?
Well, he would say it's better to exist than not to exist. Like if God did exist, how perfect would he be? What kind of God would that be? that didn't even exist. So the idea is that if God didn't exist, then he wouldn't be very perfect, would he? So that's like a pretty big flaw. Like if give the example, I'm like, you know, maybe I'm trying to sell you my oh no, maybe actually the counter argument. It seems kind of funny, right? I'll hold the counter argument for a minute here. But so the idea is, if you think about the concept of God, God is a perfect being. He's perfect in every way. He would have to have all the perfect making qualities. So he would have to have all knowledge, because if God didn't know something, that would mean he was lacking something and he was imperfect. If God didn't know the capital of Assyria, he would be imperfect. Similarly, if there's something God can't do, then he wouldn't be perfect. If God wouldn't be all powerful. If God told a lie, or I don't know, treated somebody in a shoddy fashion, it seems like he wouldn't be perfect either, right? He wouldn't be morally perfect. If God had a self-esteem problem, or had to prove himself or something like that, that seems like that would be bad too. He wouldn't be perfect in every way. You have this idea, maybe with your human father. Maybe when you're a really little kid, you think your father is perfect, and then you see him blow stack and get upset about something, or you see him get a ticket from a police officer and behave in a shoddy way and get wrestled to the ground and carted away, or and then you're like, oh well, I thought my dad was perfect, but now I see he's just a flawed human being like the rest of us, right? So it just takes one little thing to think, okay, because perfection is an all or nothing thing. So you can't be perfect. There's not degrees of I don't know, we'll maybe talk about whether there's degrees of perfection, but it seems like it's an all or nothing thing, and that one flaw means that you're not really perfect, and so. Existence as a perfection means that it's just better to exist than not to exist.
So, reality exists, so wouldn't that mean that reality is perfect?
So, yeah, so the idea isn't that everything that exists is perfect. The idea that to exist is seen as a quality the thing has or doesn't have, right? So, and you might say Sherlock Holmes would be more perfect if he existed. It would be better if Sherlock Holmes existed. But he's a fictional character, so he's not as perfect as, say, I don't know, some existing detective who actually does detection in real life.
Because it's hard to say that God created us.
Yes.
So then aren't we perfect by default? And how does he reconcile that? Because why wouldn't God not make a perfect creature if he was perfect? Was he flawed in make us?
So I think what Descartes would say is that he gave us free will and we could choose to do good or evil, and we chose to do evil, and so now we're
So free will is
flawed and
perfect.
imperfect. What's that?
Free will is perfect.
Yeah.
Given by God. So then everything we do is perfect, so we're not morally correct or incorrect, then, right?
Well, Descartes would say that the gift of free will could be misused, and that's like part of what it is to have free will. What's that?
Perfectly
I mean-
misused, because free will is perfection by God.
Well,
I
free
could say
will is a
misused
perfect
because you
quality.
can still achieve something even though it's not the morally correct free will choice.
So there are
You can
perfect
still
lives.
complete
That's
something.
not contradicted in like itself.
Well, no, if you do something wrong with your free will, then you've done something imperfect. You would say that you've, but the fact that it,
Maybe the perfection is that you can make any
I
choice.
perfectly messed up.
It's just sub levels.
so actually, we'll get to this when we talk about the problem of evil. I mean, you're on to something there. So let's put that aside for a moment. I suppose that you might say that maybe God isn't you look at the world around us, you're like, well, it looks like whoever made this mess, isn't a perfect being. So the story that Descartes would tell is that God created a perfect universe that's perfect in every way, and then it all went wrong when Adam sinned. And Adam had the only perfectly free will choice that was ever given, and he made a wrong choice, and we're all paying for it. And it's original sin.
That doesn't sound like free will.
And I think Descartes would say you have free will, but it's more constrained than it was for Adam. But Adam made a perfectly free choice, and that because of his bad choice, the tendency to disobey God and make morally bad choices is in all of our natures.
What about animals? Are they perfect? Because nature does seem to work out like really synchronistically without our intervention. Even in like its fluctuations and like changes in its terrain and everything. I mean, like, are we like somehow disconnected from God because we're the only ones that don't fit in this seemingly perfect state of?
That's a good question. I think Descartes might agree with that.
But animals can be cannibalistic. Animals murder.
But they maintain a balance too, though.
I think you
Well,
point
why
out.
does that balance matter, though? I mean, like humans kill people.
Because
Humans
then
are cannibals.
it would basically, we kind of like, as our species, basically took that upon ourselves and we're fucking everything up. We're just killing everything else.
Yeah.
Because we misbalanced it. The balance in nature seems to be like
I mean, like tigers,
population
though.
control too, though. They
Well,
really-
yeah, that's true.
We take the wolves out so we don't have to see wolves killing all the other animals, and then like the whole Yellowstone just starts to change. We bring the wolves back and like it fixes itself because we need to have them kill and eat,
You could say the ecosystem is perfect.
which includes the killing and
But then,
cannibalism of-
natural events of Earth could totally knock out that perfect ecosystem. So, is the world's ecosystem perfect as well? Maybe
If it
not.
recovers.
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
And this goes in.
What's the timeline of perfection?
Did you have? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Carl. Did you?
I was trying to remember, there's like a point in time, like long, long ago, where no animals or anything on Earth could digest the tree bark. So there's just too many trees everywhere. There's too much oxygen. And it really messed everything up.
Yeah.
Well, it's also true, like that if like there are like radical environmental laws that keep like foresters from logging the dead wood or pruning trees, leads to a situation where you get a huge like wildfires,
Mhm.
and then the whole turns into a tinderbox and just be a lightning strike. Doesn't have to be somebody's cigarette butt, and then it burns down all the trees and kills all the woodland creatures and takes some houses with it. And so all the radical environmentalists, just burned down the forest and killed all the animals and took some people's homes with it too. So, congratulations.
Do you think
But
perfection?
so the forest management can actually turn out to create a more positive outcome than like just sort of letting nature take its course.
Do you think perfection could make imperfection?
That's a really good question.
Perfectly imperfect.
Could, and this is a good question
I
about
mean, the
whether a
fundamentals
perfect
of
God
the
could
universe are
create.
perfect.
So
But it
there's
leads
a
to imperfections.
So remember the philosopher Leibniz, who came up with that the pre-established harmony view, that occasionalism or parallelism, this idea that that God synced up the spiritual and the physical worlds so that they look like they interact, but they really don't. He also invented calculus. So one of his other views is that this must be the best of all possible worlds, because a perfect God would only create perfection, and so this must be as good as it's logically possible for the world to be. And to make fun of that, we'll get to the problem of evil later, which will challenge that. And there's a book called Candide by Voltaire, and in the novel, they're on board a ship watching the Lisbon earthquake, it's in Portugal, and it's like one of the worst earthquakes ever, and like, you know, thousands of people died, and so they're on the ship, so they're like immune from the earthquake, and they're watching the city crumble, and then and there's this philosopher named Pangloss, who's a thinly veiled caricature of Leibniz, and he says, "This is the best of all possible worlds," right? and then somebody on board the ship says, "I'm going to go in and loot the city," right? So you get, like, on top of the natural evil of the city being destroyed, you have, you know, moral evil from human beings taking advantage of natural disasters. So that it seems like there might be a question about whether a perfect being could create the imperfect world we live in. And we'll get to that. That's the essence of, I think, the problem of evil, if you cash out, like, human suffering and maybe animal suffering too, as something which seems inconsistent with a perfect being, and particularly a morally perfect being. So let's look at Anselm's version. So Descartes' version hits on this idea that God has to be perfect. That if God's anything, God is a perfect being, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't have any flaws, doesn't have a self-esteem problem, doesn't have character issues. He's got to be perfect in every way. And if that's true, then he would have to exist in order to be perfect, because existence is a perfection. It's better to exist than not to exist.
Was the Epicurus who, like, suggested that if God was omnipotent, then there would be no evil?
Yeah, so that's the problem of evil, classical version of it, that if God is omnipotent, he'd be able to prevent evil. If God is good, he'd want to prevent evil. Whence then evil? Okay.
What if the absence of good is evil, which is the case? But, like, does darkness exist?
Okay, heavy duty question.
What about
We'll come to that.
neutrality?
We'll come to that in
I'm sure you've all heard this one.
next week. Yeah. So Anselm's version is different. It's a form of indirect proof, or this argument form called reductio ad absurdum, which means to reduce to an absurdity. So this argument type is when you take your opponent's view and you show that leads to some sort of absurdity or contradiction. So let's say, okay, for the sake of argument, let's suppose that what you say is true. Okay, well, if this is true, then this thing is true. If this thing is true, then this thing is true. And therefore, at the end of the line, you say, so the overall implication of what you believe is this thing. And it's something that's, like, crazy that nobody would believe, or it's something that's actually a logical contradiction. You see this a lot in politics, the good old reductio argument, and the idea is to show that if you start out with a certain premise, it's going to lead to something that nobody would accept. I don't know if I want to go into a bunch of examples of this. I'll just take Anselm's example as it is. So his idea, instead of trying to prove that God exists, he tries to prove that it's impossible for God not to exist, right? That's kind of a tricky strategy, right? So you could try to give evidence or reasons why God exists, or you could show that atheism leads to a contradiction. In other words, that it's impossible for God not to exist, right? And this is sort of like the double negative gets you a positive, right? So if it's impossible that God doesn't exist, then God has to exist. So let's see how he does this. So he says, okay, start out, and let's assume God doesn't exist. So let's take the fool at his word. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Let's suppose there isn't a God. So what does the fool really mean by this? Well, what he's saying, he doesn't deny the idea that people believe in God or that there's a concept of God. He just thinks that concept doesn't map onto anything in reality. It's just an idea in your mind. So the fool is saying that God exists only in the mind. Now, who is God? Well, he starts with his definition of God not as a perfect being, but as the greatest conceivable being. God is the greatest thing you can imagine, right? So because if you could imagine a thing greater than God, that thing you're thinking about isn't really God. God is the greatest being you can imagine. No one is greater than God. So what is the fool saying? The fool, you just replace the word God with greatest conceivable being, right? Because that's the definition of God. We should be able to just swap out the word God for the definition of God, and it should be just fine in our argument, right? So what he's saying is that the fool is saying the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind. Okay, think about this statement. The greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind.
But that means it exists to some degree, because like, my mind exists and my thought exists. Which
Right,
means
sure. But it exists only in your mind. But that can't be true, because you can imagine a greater being which exists not just in your mind as an idea, but in reality as well, right? So in other words, let's see, do I have that? I don't have that there. So, I mean, what this amounts to is you're saying the greatest conceivable being isn't really the greatest conceivable being. Right? Because if it was the greatest, he would exist outside the mind. So the idea is if you say the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind, that's a contradiction, because you're saying the greatest conceivable being isn't really the greatest conceivable being, which is contradictory, right? It's like I'm saying this cup isn't this cup, right? That's a contradiction.
Where's his proof for the greater being there, though?
So his proof of what? His proof of what? The
Greater being, because he's like, that's wrong because there is a greater being, but what?
No,
greater
he's
being
just
is-
talking about. So he's just talking about what's possible. So he says, God's the greatest conceivable being and the greatest imaginable being, right? So you can, if you say the greatest being imaginable exists only in your mind, that's a contradiction, because you could imagine a being existing in your mind and in his reality as well, right? So you're sort of thinking about, so compare like two things, like there's an imaginary God and a God which is real. Which one's greater? Well, obviously the real God is greater than the imaginary God. So the imaginary God exists only in your imagination. The real God exists in your imagination. He's in your mind, but he's also in reality. That being is going to be greater. So if you define God as the greatest conceivable being, he has to exist. So I mean, the long and short of this is the greatest conceivable being has to exist.
So empirically, we're God because we're the greatest conceivable being that exists in and outside of the mind.
Okay, that seems like it doesn't follow.
But there's like, I can't like find any tangible.
Why do you
evidence.
think that you're the great? I mean, you're talking about humanity as
Yeah,
the greatest
yeah.
conceivable being, but that's not true, because you could imagine like humanity just as it is, and it can fly through the air like Superman, right? You
But
can
we don't
imagine that.
exist because that's only in the mind, but outside of the mind, we are the greatest being out there so far. So like
But that's not
we
about
all
what's
exist.
that's not about what's conceivable, though. That's just about what exists, right? He's not talking about what exists. That would be like begging the question or circular reasoning.
So because I can imagine myself better, we're not the greatest.
Uh,
Because the two don't line up with in my
right.
mind.
You could imagine like
No.
so suppose I say I'm the greatest conceivable being, and you can say, well, I can imagine somebody better than you, Bardell, who's like, still got all his hair or whatever, right? And I could say, I could imagine like you would be, I can imagine being just like you, but who plays the guitar really well, like your twin brother.
So doesn't it beg the question that like if I'm not the greatest conceivable being, how do I have the ability to perceive the greatest being? So do I even have the ability to understand what what perfection is? If I'm an imperfect being, I couldn't like imagine perfection because I'm an imperfect being. So then like
So this is like, it's
How
like
I
an
address that,
epistemological
yeah.
question. Descartes actually makes an argument for God's existence based on this. Maybe you're thinking of that. He says only the concept of God must be an innate idea in our minds, because there's no way we could have come up with the idea of a perfect being if we're imperfect beings. Where did the concept of a perfect God come from if we're imperfect beings? But it's, and I suppose Descartes might just say that. He might say, well, that's yet another proof for God's existence. And that's more of a, that's also an a priori argument. Descartes loves these a priori arguments. So he'd say that, perfection can't create, or imperfection can't create perfection. Therefore, God, you have this concept of God as a perfect being. Where did that come from? Well, it must come from a real God who gave you the concept of himself. But that's a different argument. Let me just come back to this idea of, like, what's conceivable. So he's arguing about, you think about the concept of God. It's the greatest conceivable being, that nobody is greater than God. So imagine, like, I don't know, someone will say, like, there's a being who of great power and might, who created the earth. And, and then you say, okay, that's God. And they're like, no, he was created by another being who created, and then he created the earth. Well, it seems like that first being, if he's created, he's not really God, because he's depends on another person for his existence. Or, and maybe the God example is not that. Maybe I should pick another example. It's thinking about. So you're thinking about what's conceivable, like so. So it's talking about what you can hold in your mind or your imagination. So as you think about, okay, I can think about there's this imaginary God. God is a figment of your imagination. God as a social construct. God as projection of the father figure, right? And it's all up here, right? It's just an idea. There's no reality to it, right? So then what's the fool saying? He's saying that oh yeah, God's the greatest concealable being, but he's only up here. He's only in your mind. Well, that's contradictory, because how can the greatest imaginable being exist only in your mind? You compare that with a greater being, which exists in your mind, but also in reality as well, and that being's going to be greater. So if you say the greatest only exists in your mind, you're saying the greatest isn't really the greatest, and that's a contradiction. If God didn't exist, how great would he be? Certainly, an imaginary God is not as great as an actual God.
How can we imagine something perfect even though we've never experienced anything perfect?
So that's Descartes' argument about the concept of perfect being. Anselm says it talks about this concept of greatness. So,
because all I think about perfection is like geometrical perfection. You have a sphere and it's perfectly smooth or something like that. That's like my best guess at perfection. But then when you start to put like perfection on entities, it's like, where do you go?
It's a good question. I think you can get at both these. You think about the concept of perfection or greatness. Maybe those ideas are sort of vague. Let me just finish up like how he gets this argument here. He starts out saying, so the fool is saying the greatest conceivable being exists only in the mind. Okay, why is that a contradiction? Well, if he's the greatest, how can he exist only in the mind? And so if any being that exists only in the mind isn't the greatest conceivable being, so you just replace that. You're saying the greatest conceivable being isn't really the greatest conceivable being, because you can think of a greater being exists in reality as well. So if you can conceive of a greater being which exists in reality as well, then the imaginary one you're thinking of isn't the greatest. So the fool saying the greatest conceivable being isn't really the greatest conceivable being. And that's a contradiction. That's A is not A. That's, I am not me, or the chair is not the chair. Right? It's an obvious contradiction. Since atheism leads to a contradiction, atheism has to be false. And if you got if it's not the case that God doesn't exist, then God has to exist.
Oh boy.
Well, if God exists, he would definitely be better than the God that I could conceive being. So then, how does he reconcile that, the God in our minds will never be the God in reality, and they don't even correlate together because of our imperfection and our understanding of the greatness?
I think Anselm would say the idea of God in your mind might not be exactly the way God is in reality, but it's still the concept of God. You might get some details wrong, or you might not know you might not be able to wrap your mind around God's greatness, but you have an idea in your mind. Maybe it's kind of vague and hazy about what God is. Like you think about, like, you can like look at a mountain, and you don't need to like climb the mountain to know what the mountain is and to have some idea of its nature. You can look at it. Like I look at Mount Hood from the airplane, and I don't have to risk death and with a suicidal impulse to climb it, and then have to have the state fly some helicopters there to rescue me when I get stranded. As happens every year.
Yeah.
So I can I look at Mount Hood and I can have an appreciation for its existence and its nature, but I don't have to climb it, so I don't need to do a geological survey or know all its details. And maybe if I never climb Mount Hood, I won't know all the details, but I have a general idea what the mountain's about. So I think Anselm would say the same thing is true about God.
Mm.
So if God, and we're at our break here, so let's take 10. You can contemplate whether the concept of God implies his actual existence or necessary existence.
Ugh.
And we're back. So the Anselm's trying to argue that if you think about the concept of God long enough, you'll see God exists by definition, that God can't possibly not exist. And it's not based on evidence or that using your senses. It's just based when you close your eyes and you think about the concept of God. What is God? God is the greatest being imaginable. And you think, well, is it possible that God doesn't exist? And Anselm actually, he puts his argument in the form of a prayer, right? So he says, "Oh Lord, thank you that not only do I believe by faith, but that as I meditate on your very nature and essence, I see that it's not possible for you to not exist." And so that Anselm has a little slogan, which is I suppose typical of the Middle Ages, where he says, so Anselm already believes, and then he comes with a philosophical argument to prove God's existence. But he does it as an act of worship and devotion. So it's not like Anselm's like a skeptic who says, well, let's see whether there's a God or not. And if I come to the conclusion God does exist, well then I'll leave the monastery and go make an honest living. Right? So he's so it's in the form of a prayer and this idea, and he says, I don't reason in order to believe. I don't. So he says, I don't understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. So in other words, I start out with faith, and then in order to understand God more fully, here's a philosophical argument for God's existence that you can really know about him. But the idea that God's not on trial here. I'm not trying to prove God's existence. I already believe in God through faith, and now I'm going to prove God exists through reason as an act of worship. Both Descartes, I think, and then also Aquinas, I think, would take a different view on that. And they would say that reason unaided can prove God's existence, and that people without faith can still have a rational belief in God and are still accountable for not believing in God if they don't, because of the light of natural reason shows them that God exists. And there's some precedent for that in the Bible too, where I think the Apostle Paul says that the existence of God is plainly known through creation. And so, going off that, you have Aquinas arguing for God's existence based on the nature of the world. Anselm's doing something different, though. He's saying that if you just think about the concept of God, you'll see that he has to exist. Now, there's another monk. I'm just going to skip over that thing. There's another monk named Ganillo, and Ganillo's has a counter argument. So not everybody agrees with Anselm, and so Ganillo wrote this. He wrote this little essay called "On Behalf of the Fool," right? So Anselm, starts out by quoting this psalm from the Bible that says, "The fool has said in their heart, has said in his heart, there is no God." And so Ganillo writes, he's like coming to the defense of the fool. Maybe the fool has a point. So on behalf of the fool. And so and this is another monk, right? So and he's also a person of faith. So Ganillo believes in God too. He just thinks that Anselm's argument is not a good way to prove God's existence and that it's logically flawed. So he comes up with a counter example in terms of the greatest conceivable island objection. And sometimes it's called the perfect island or the lost island. So he says, okay, imagine the greatest conceivable island. It's perfect in every way. It's got, beautiful beaches. It's warm and sunny. The weather is nice all the time. It's like Santa Barbara or something. It's very unlike Eugene, say. And it's the kind of place you close your eyes and think about going to when the rain's coming down. You think it might snow and your hands hurt just from walking outside and everything's soggy and moldy. And you're like, oh, if only I was at some perfect island. And you have a picture of it in your mind, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that greatest conceivable island not only exists, but must exist. What, you doubt me? You doubt that the greatest conceivable island exists? Well, consider, if the greatest conceivable island exists only in the mind, would it really be the greatest?
But can it exist?
What's that?
But can it exist?
I'll hold that thought for a moment, right? So think about if the greatest conceivable if the greatest conceivable island exists only in the mind, then you can imagine a greater island, which exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And so when you deny my greatest island, you're really, you island skeptic, you're committing a logical contradiction, because you're saying the greatest conceivable the greatest conceivable island isn't really the greatest conceivable island, which is a logical contradiction. Therefore, the greatest conceivable island must exist.
Huh.
So you see what he's doing here? And I kept on, putting the word being, because I'm used to saying greatest conceivable being about 20 times. So, but
I
you
can
can see,
get it though. That makes
yeah.
a lot
So
more
he's like,
sense.
he's using the same argument form and showing that it leads to a ridiculous conclusion. Yeah.
By that argument, though, wouldn't everything that you can imagine exist? Like, if you can imagine that there's aliens, then there really must be aliens because they exist outside of your imagination, and saying that they don't exist proves that they exist?
So that I think that you're hitting on that's sort of his objection. So this is an objection to the ontological argument. It's an objection to Anselm, and it's not. So Anselm's not saying that everything you can imagine exists. He's saying the greatest conceivable being has to exist. And so Ganillo says, okay, well, what about the greatest conceivable island? Would that have to exist?
But wouldn't
Or
the
the
greatest
greatest-
conceivable island be different for every single person?
That might be another question about what. Then it comes back to the question of what greatest means, right?
Yeah.
Are you talking about personal preference? Are you talking about like size? Are you talking about
Yeah.
What does it even mean? Because what would like the greatest conceivable turnip be like, right? Or the greatest conceivable coffee mug. So it just seems like, but then the idea here, this, and that might be that's even another objection. But it seems at least that this greatest island objection. Let's assume there's some objective quality of the perfect island. Then it seems like even if you have this concept of perfect island, that wouldn't prove that that island existed, right? So, like what you say is just right, except you have to add the word perfect in, right, to make it, sorry, not perfect, greatest, right? So, you'd have to say like the greatest conceivable alien or something like that, or the greatest conceivable, unicorn, right? Yeah, the greatest conceivable unicorn would have to exist according to his argument. But it's obvious that like unicorns don't exist, and this example is just made up, right? It's just he's creating this fake concept to try to prove that, okay, here's this perfect island that obviously doesn't exist. I'm going to use Anselm's argument to prove it exists. Yeah.
Do you remember me talking about, I don't know if it was the last term or it was this term, but I was talking about like quantum consciousness and how the imagination is actually just our minds being able to be able to come up with anything that can exist, because we can imagine anything, but it's because it does exist. But maybe not in our realm or in our reality, but a different reality or infinite different realities.
I do remember that.
Yeah, okay, good. So I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking about here is if you can think of something then.
If you can imagine something exists in some
And
world.
especially if the universe is infinite, which allows for infinite probability.
This actually fits in with, there's another version of this called the modal version, which is based on possible worlds, which we'll get to in just a minute. But
What's that?
it's tough because all this stuff's related. So so I want to make sure everyone understands like what his objection is. So Anselm says the greatest concealed being would have to exist, and then Ganillo's saying not so fast. According to your reasoning, Anselm, the greatest conceivable, banana would exist. The greatest conceivable, quill pen. The greatest conceivable monk, right? And here's this fake island, the greatest island that's perfect in every way. But obviously, I'm just making up this for the sake of a philosophical example to disprove your argument. So just because I can imagine this island that's the greatest I can think of doesn't mean it exists in reality. So so this argument could prove all kinds of things that are obviously not true. An argument that can prove anything proves nothing. So here's Anselm's response. He says, well, I'm not arguing that the greatest conceivable type of thing has to exist. That for every type of thing, like this cup, my watch, the greatest conceivable energy bar, right? I'm not arguing that every type of thing has to exist in reality. I'm arguing that the greatest thing imaginable has to exist. And that's what God is. God is the greatest imaginable existing thing, the greatest conceivable being. Being, B-E-I-N-G, meaning existing thing. Yeah.
Help me pull this into a better understanding, but if we can imagine things that aren't actually possible, so if you can just imagine something that's impossible, like...
I think Anselm would disagree with that.
Huh?
Anselm would say you can't imagine things that aren't possible.
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes more sense then.
So it's like if you can say the words round square, but you can't really
Yeah.
picture it in your mind.
Yeah, okay.
Now it's interesting because he's saying that the fool can say there is no God, and that's actually a contradiction.
Yeah.
But then the question about like does he have an idea of atheism in his mind? Because I think Descartes would say, or both Descartes and Anselm would say he has sort of the illusion of meaning, but it's just sort of like this sort of hazy notion that's not really thought out. Or you might have two ideas that disagree, but you don't see that they disagree. That could be another
So if
idea.
you can't imagine it, it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, he would say if you can't imagine something, it can't exist. So there's two things here. So the greatest conceivable being has to exist, and it's impossible for him not to exist. But it's also true. So if God's existence isn't possible, then it can't be actual. So if God's existence was contradictory in some way, then God couldn't possibly exist in any possible world. Again, we're getting the modal thing, so hold that thought for just a minute. So Anselm says that Ganello is misreading his argument. He's trying to refute it by saying, okay, here's an argument just like yours that proves all kinds of ridiculous things. And Anselm says, no, I'm just saying that it's for this one particular case, the grays conceal being in general, not types of being. So, and you think about the island, right? So imagine, okay, this is the greatest imaginable island. Well, you know, islands are made of sand, right? They come into being, they pass away, they get covered by the ocean, right? So what if it's like an eternal island that has always existed, okay? What if, you know, an island isn't conscious, it's just like a bar of sand. What if we imbue that island with consciousness? An island doesn't really do anything, it just kind of sits there, right? So a really great island would be an island that can do lots of different things. Well, how many things could it do? Well, what the greatest island would be able to do anything, right? So our island is eternal and omnipotent. What if our island would had all power but did evil, right? Well, you know, a bad character, evil seems to be a flaw or lack. So it seems like our island would have to be benevolent, and our island would have to what if our island was like made mistakes and
it rained
did
ice
certain
cream.
things, right? Okay, that might be that's a good part of the island, right?
Yeah.
But the bad part of the island. So we have an island, like if we want if we want the greatest island, the greatest concealed island would be omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and the ground of morality. Well, that's God, right? So it's starting to look like God.
Yeah.
So his idea is that once you take down the islandness, like the type of thing that you're talking about, and you start thinking about the greatest being imaginable, it starts to look like God. So Ganello's argument is really it's like a straw man. It's attacking a different argument that Anselm didn't make. Okay, Kant's objection. So Kant's a smart guy. Kant also believes in God. He likes the moral argument for God's existence. He thinks the ontological argument's all wet. And here's what he says. Existence isn't a property. Now, Kant likes to talk in terms of language, and so he's like really the first linguistic philosopher. So he says it's not a real predicate. So you know, like in grammar, you have the subject and the predicate. And his idea is that if you say, I don't know, if I say my car is old, right? That's a real predicate. I can say my car is leaking oil. That's a real predicate. Subject, my car. Predicate, leaking oil. If I say, my car is overheating, right? That's a real predicate. If I say my car exists, that's different. That's saying subject and predicate, all the qualities it has is part of the world. That's different than saying my car is dirty or my car has been washed in 10 years, right? Those are predicates. Those are things that are true about my car. My car is a Toyota, maybe that's part of its essence or something. But it's not, those are different than talking about whether I'm making up my car and whether my car even exists. Maybe I'm carless and it's my secret shame that I don't own an automobile. Or maybe, and I'm on the loser cruiser every day. Or maybe, or the bus. Actually, I started riding the bus because my car is broken down, and I think there's perfectly fine, that riding the bus is a perfectly fine lifestyle choice.
I just really like that term.
But there's a difference between saying this desk is made of wood, or this desk is brown, and this desk exists, right? So being brown or rectangular or being made of wood, those are real predicates or properties, if we want to talk in metaphysical terms, of the desk. Saying the desk exists is to say that the thing, the desk, and its properties together are instantiated in the world, that they exist. So instantiated just means there's an instance of the idea in the world. So there's the concept of this desk. and then there's like the real existence of the desk. So what Kant says is there aren't two concepts of a real imaginary $100 and an actual $100. Like suppose I'd say, well, what do I have in my pocket? Do I have a real $100 in my pocket or an imaginary $100? Those are exactly the same concept. They're just the concept of $100. There's no concept of real $100 and concept of imaginary $100. So either the concept of $100 is instantiated in my pocket, or it isn't, and I don't have any money in my pocket at all, right? So it's there's either a manifestation, if you like, of that concept in the world in this particular way in my pocket, or not. There aren't different concepts of the real $100 in Barbadale's pocket versus the imaginary $100 in my pocket. They're the same concept. And what Anselm does is he plays this game, and he talks about he's thinking about the concept of an imaginary God versus a real God. Well, there's just really the concept of God. You can't break it into imaginary God and real God. And then what Anselm tries to do is to argue that, well, of course, a real God is greater than an imaginary God. But there's only one concept there. It's just the concept of God. You can't have real God versus imaginary God because there's no concept of an imaginary God. A concept of imaginary God is just taking the concept of God and then saying that God doesn't exist. So there's like two separate concepts kind of glommed together. So you're taking a concept and you're saying it doesn't exist in the world. That's different than the concept. So you can't mix and match like statements about concepts and ideas with statements about what exists. Those are two separate things. So first you think about the concept, and then you like use your senses to figure out whether it exists in the world. And this is the point that David Hume makes, that concepts can tell you what doesn't exist, but they can't tell you what does exist. So like if I made you bet that I have a round square in my pocket, or a circular square if you like, or a spherical cube, right? That's a bet you can't lose, because there is no such object, because those are contrary properties. Or if I say, I bet you $100 that that I baked a cake all by myself that my twin brother helped me bake. That would be a bet you can lose, right? Because if I baked it all by myself, then my twin brother didn't help me bake it. So a contradiction can't be true, and so a contradictory concept can't be instantiated in the world. So existence applies. So concepts can tell you about what can exist, but they can't tell you about what does exist. So existence applies to a thing and its properties together. It's not itself a property. So there's a difference between being brown or square or tall or gooey, or right. You can think of all the qualities things can have of being old, or even like all sorts of being heavy.
So is that perfect?
So no, those are all qualities, right? So objects have properties like being,
But like if something has every property, would it be perfect? So like the perfect animal. How would you define the perfect
You couldn't have every property, because some properties are exclusive of other properties. It can't be like old and young at the same time in the same respect, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay, here's how I look at it. So the universe has everything. So the universe has old, the universe has new, the universe has every single adjective in it, just different forms. So technically you could say that the universe is perfect.
So what fallacy is that from our critical thinking course last
God,
time?
no. What have I done? Oh, because of that?
No, it's the, I guess that'd be it'd either be the composition or the division fallacy, right? So just because the whole has a property doesn't mean the parts have it, or just because the parts have it doesn't mean the whole has it, right? So, let's come back to this. So a thing, its properties, say my car, and it's, suppose I'm trying to sell you my car, and like, Well, it runs well. It's 20 years old. It's a Toyota Corolla. It's got 260,000 miles on it. It's got air conditioning. It still works. And it's got 2 busted taillights. One I did, it's one somebody else did. And the best part of my car, which was like, will really sell you on it, it exists. You think, wait a minute, Bardell, you're going to sell me a non-existent car? I'm like, no, it really does exist. That's the best part of it. You think, well, just the fact that you're talking about your car, that's already assumed it exists. Like,
Yeah.
existence isn't a quality of my car, like having 263,000 miles on it, or being dirty and having 2 busted taillights taped up by red tape that's now turned yellow. Right? It's it either that the car, the thing in its qualities either exists or it doesn't. It's either instantiated in the world or it's not. Existence isn't a quality itself. It's not a property or a real predicate. It's different than all those other categories. So properties or predicates describe existing things, and they describe how they exist. But the fact that they exist or not is different. That applies to the thing and its properties. So like Sherlock Holmes, has qualities like he wears a deerskin hat, and he's super intelligent, plays a violin, has a mood disorder, and constantly insults and berates his faithful friend Dr. Watson. And you wouldn't say, and he doesn't exist. It's not like the same property as like playing the violin, right? It's different. So you take Sherlock Holmes, the person, and then all his qualities exist as a concept. And then that concept is either instantiated in the world, there is such a person as Sherlock Holmes, or there isn't. And every year tourists go around looking for 221B Baker Street, which is where he lives, thinking they'll find the historic home of Sherlock Holmes. I think the guy just sold the place because he's tired of being bothered by tourists. Because there actually is such a place.
Mr. Sherlock Holmes is actually real?
No, he's a fictional character.
Okay.
Right. So then
Sure.
the question, that question, is Sherlock Holmes real, is a different question than does Sherlock Holmes smoke a pipe, or does Sherlock Holmes play the violin well, right? So
Okay.
in the stories, both those things are true. So here's a question: is Sherlock Holmes smarter than his brother Mycroft? It turns out that according to the stories, Mycroft is actually smarter. He's just really lazy, which is why he works for the government. So this is true in the stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He's got this brother Mycroft who's like really fat and super lazy, and usually shuffles off work to his brother when he can. But he's like super smart, and actually smarter than his brother. So that's a different question than whether like Holmes exists. Whether Holmes exists is a different kind of question. It's not a question about the qualities of Sherlock Holmes. It's a question about whether the person and his qualities exist or not. Okay, so here's the modal version of the ontological argument. So this is Norman Malcolm, and so he's thinking about this idea of God as a necessary being. So what is a necessary being? A necessary being is a being that has to exist. So remember that Anselm's argument is supposed to show not only that God's non-existence is contradictory, but it implies therefore that God must exist. Anselm proves or attempts to prove that it's impossible for God not to exist. So the conclusion is stronger than God does in fact exist. It's that God has to exist, that it's not possible for God not to exist. So then you think about, this idea of God as a necessary being. If God's existence is possible, so you start out by saying, could you imagine, suppose there is in fact a God? Would that God's existence be accidental, or would it be necessary? In other words, could you imagine the world turning out such that there isn't a God, right? So like I'm not a necessary being. So it could be, that my parents, never cohabited on that fateful night, right? There's a certain time where sperm and egg met, and it could be like the egg that was ovulated and the sperm that met it, never met and never formed me as a zygote, and I never grew. Maybe I could have been aborted, right? So there's all sorts of ways the world, my parents may not have even met, right? So there's all sorts of ways in which you can imagine the world turned out such that I never existed. So I'm not a necessary being. Now the question is God like that? Is God a contingent being? That's the opposite of being a necessary being. And most people would say no, if there is a God, he would have to exist. That God isn't the sort of being who could possibly not exist. So you start out by thinking, okay, let's suppose we agree with that if there is a God, he's a necessary being. That part of the concept of God is of a being that couldn't possibly not exist. Well, that means that if God's existence is possible, then it has to be actual, right? So if God exists, he exists in all possible worlds. That would mean he exists in this world. So God would have to exist. So once you admit this concept that God is a necessary being, that would mean that he would have to exist. That God exists in all possible worlds.
I think the true proof for God will be if we do, in fact, meet another alien race and they have the exact same story.
Well, maybe they have the same superstitions from and it's a rule of the evolution of life that people personify the forces of nature. That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, it definitely strikes some debates.
Okay, so then, how are you going to argue against that? Well, you might just say, is the existence of God really possible? So that's one way you might argue. Let's see. So there's all these paradoxes that you can sort of try to poke holes in the concept of God as being incoherent. So here's one that's kind of a traditional one. So could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it?
Oh, yeah.
What do you think? Would you say yes or no? Could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it?
Yeah, but if he couldn't make it, then he wouldn't be perfect.
Right. So let's suppose you say yes, God couldn't make a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it. So could God make a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it? So suppose you say no, then there's something God can't do. He can't create that rock. Okay, well, he's omnipotent. You'd have to say yes. So then after God creates the rock, there's something he can't do, namely not lift the rock, right? So anyway, so God either can't create the rock or he can't lift the rock once he's created it, and either way, he's not really all powerful. And the idea here is to try to show the concept of omnipotence is incoherent or self-contradictory.
It's definitely a good question.
Yeah, so that's one. So the idea is that if you can show there's something incoherent with the concept of God or logically contradictory, then you might show that God's existence is if God has to exist as a necessary being, if his existence isn't possible, it can't be actual. Another argument like that is the problem of evil, which we talked about a minute ago. So it's not really a contradiction in the concept of God. Well, I suppose it depends on how you think about creator of the world as a property. So the idea is that God's all powerful, he's all good, and he's creator of this world.
Yeah.
And this world contains lots of evil and suffering. So you'd say, well, if God created the world, he'd want to prevent suffering, and he'd be able to prevent suffering, yet suffering exists. So there's a contradiction in the idea that God's creator of the world and totally good and also all powerful. So those three things can't be true. So that would be show God's existence is impossible. If it's not possible, that can't be actual. So some other things, I think we hit on a few of these things. So one thing you might say, like if the concept of God is contradictory, you might just say, well, God doesn't really exist in the mind. Like Anselm says, if God exists in the mind, you can think of a greater being that exists just not in the mind, but reality. And that maybe if God, the concept of God is contradictory, maybe it's not a true concept. It's like, again, it's like circular square. Maybe it's a logical contradiction and not a true idea. The other thing is this idea of like, to say that something exists in the mind, it seems like you're playing games with the word exists. Like if I say, well, Sherlock Holmes exists, and you say, no, he doesn't, he's a fictional character. And I say, oh yeah, well, he exists in my mind. He exists in the old time radio shows and the stories, right? It's kind of, you're equivocating or using the word exists in different ways, in different contexts, and pretending like they're the same. So to say something exists in the mind isn't really to say exists, it just says somebody has a concept. And that's, Anselm's argument seems to rely on this kind of dual meaning for the word exists, applying it to both like a mental construct and an object in the world. The other idea is this idea of greater. What makes one thing greater than another? Is the planet Jupiter greater than the human DNA molecule? Right. So the DNA molecule is that undergirds all life, not just human life. So the DNA molecule is more complex and intricately designed, and but it's also like super tiny, right? The planet Jupiter is like giant, but it's like a big ball of gas.
Could you say that the greater or greatest is the one with the most uses?
That seems to like it depends on like I don't know. That seems like a value statement, right? That
Yeah.
whether something's useful to people.
I'm just saying, like, capable of doing anything. Like Jupiter, it's really good for producing
Methane.
no,
Storms.
a magnetosphere.
Okay, yeah. So it's good. Big
It's good for that.
field,
Like,
yeah.
protect planets, like that has
Yeah.
one use, or yeah, I don't know. I guess it depends on who it's useful for.
Is the
Or for what?
Is the bubonic plague, is that like a great, is the bubonic plague greater than the cold virus? Well, bubonic plague killed more people. But we can stop it now with antibiotics. The cold virus, the flu virus, we can't get rid of those. So I suppose so one's more survivable, the other one's more deadly, which is greater. It just seems kind of, it seems like the concept of greatness is sort of this vague statement. And the way Descartes thinking about it, he's thinking about this sort of great chain of being. And this comes out of the philosophy of Plato that Descartes likes. And so he thinks about, like Plato has this idea that you have kind of like the spiritual realm where there's the true reality, and then you have the physical world, which is sort of in the middle, and then you have like shadows and reflections. And Plato says that physical objects are to shadows and reflections as are the spiritual world is the physical world. So he would say like that physical, you look at a shadow, he'd say a shadow has a lesser existence than the object that casts a shadow. Or that an image of a thing or a reflection of say, an object in the water is kind of like a lesser existing thing, but it still exists. But you would say the shadow or the reflection exists less than the physical object. And similarly, you would say the physical object doesn't exist as much as the greater object, the world of ideas or concepts. And in the Christianized version, it would be God and the angels, I guess, with the Anselm. But this idea of things having greater or lesser existence just seems kind of, and things having degrees of reality seems iffy, right? It seems like things either exist or they don't. Existence isn't something you could quantify that one thing exists more than another, and that's the way Anselm seems to be thinking about it, as things having greater or lesser existence. There's my thing about the Jupiter, the DNA molecule. So it seems like the term greater that is like the key part of the argument, right? is this sort of vague concept. What do you mean by the greater, something existing in reality being greater? Because there's a greater being which exists not in the mind but in reality as well. Let's see. So, apart from a few philosophers at Notre Dame, most people think the ontological arguments is a wash for all these reasons. Even though every once in a while somebody publishes a philosophy paper trying to defend it based on modal logic or some new way to resurrect it, but it's most people think that this is kind of like a big fail for arguments for God's existence, although it's still got its defenders. And I would say, like, of the arguments for God's existence, I've probably poisoned the well now. But most people don't find this very plausible. Now, I had a friend in college who like read that and was sure like that this was like a knockdown argument for God's existence and was super profound. And was like told, even though she already believed in God, she was totally convinced that this was a logically sound proof. But I think she was an odd person out. What do you think when you first heard this? Like before we went to the criticisms, does anybody think, "Wow, maybe that works"?
The greatest or great thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
A little
mean,
persuasive in the moment.
yeah, it definitely makes you think.
I just didn't really understand the fact that he exists is a quality that would make them perfect or something like that. It just doesn't seem right to me.
And I suppose that if you put in the abstract, so if God's the greatest concealed being, then he would have to exist in reality. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the greatest concealed being. So the idea that if you think about the concept of God hard enough, he would have to exist because God, just the concept of God is the greatest concealed being, unlike any other concept that we have. So you think about the concept which is just like a universe of one, of the thing that's the greatest thing you can imagine, right? And the idea is, well, what is that? And most people would say, well, that's God. And then you could say, could that thing possibly not exist? And you say, well, sure, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. And then you say, aha, but if it's the greatest being, then it would have to exist in reality, otherwise it wouldn't be the greatest. And they, And Bertrand Russell read the ontological argument when he was a young man, just starting out. I think he was in college. And in his autobiography, he said he took a tin of pipe tobacco and threw up in the air and said, "By Jove, the ontological argument is sound." And then 2 weeks later, like he'd read Kant's criticism and thought about some more and went back to being an atheist. But Bertrand Russell is like one of the greatest philosophers in the 20th century, like super influential. We'll read one of his early work, Free Man Worship, where you can see like the atheism coming down, so coming out pretty strongly. So this guy who's regarded as like a firebrand atheist and super influential philosopher, and even he was fooled by the ontological argument. So it seems like there you can see like for your average person, I would say it's just confusing. But if you have some sort of understanding of logic, and you think about when you think, well, I don't know, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something there.
What's the definition of ontological?
So it's the. I don't know if I think I didn't put that in there. I should put that in there. It has to do with being. So it has to do with the concept of being. So ontological means based on the concept of being, B-E-I-N-G, or existence. So it's like sometimes people talk about like an issue being an ontological or existential threat or something like that. And this is a threat to existence.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe you heard that thrown out.
Ontological threat.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like in I think earlier, like in metaphysics, there's like we talked about ontology, which is the question about whether everything's made out of matter, whether materialism is true, whether everything's made out of mind or spirit, that's idealism, or whether it's dualism, there's both matter and spirit. So
Gotcha.
that's like ontology. So those are ontological theories.
Okay.
And then,
that makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah. And so ontology also has to do with the question about, like, I don't know, whether abstract objects exist or only particulars exist,
Gotcha.
whether numbers exist, and those are like things that, you know, people write in philosophy journals and nobody reads about those things too. I had my advisor, graduate advisor, talked about, you know, he was actually thinking that would have been more fun to teach religion classes. He's like, I was talking to my friend, he's like, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm talking about, I can't remember, it was some like super interesting thing about like, I don't know, like the persecution of the Cathars in the Middle Ages or something by the Inquisition. And he's like, what are you doing? He's like, well, you know, I'm trying to publish this paper on rigid designators, which are like these sort of, this technical argument in philosophy of language, and it's like really dry and technical. And he was like, this is religion class. Teaching religion seemed like it'd be a lot more colorful and interesting. So, apart from, you know, Bertrand Russell, who's like, you know, a convert to theism for maybe 2 weeks before he went back to being an atheist based on this argument. Most people aren't convinced by this, although some people who already believe in God think this is a good argument. Much like Anselm, I think Anselm would like that. Anselm would say, I'm not trying to convince the atheist, because the atheist really has a moral problem and they're running away from God and they're morally corrupt. And those people I'm not really talking to. I'm talking to the believer, and I'm showing you how, even though you believe in the basis of faith, which is good and right, here's a reason why you should worship God even more, because it's not even possible to contemplate God's non-existence without seeing that he actually has to exist. That it would be impossible for God not to exist. And how great is that?
It does say, if you think about the concept of God hard enough, if you really think about something hard enough,
It's yourself with anything.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that might be another criticism, right? You might say that.
Like sometimes if you, let's say you make a lie, and you tell yourself, you know, how's it go?
The-
Like basically just fabricating your
Yeah.
own past.
Yeah.
It's possible
think-
if you believe it enough.
To be fair to Anselm, I mean, you might say, well, you spend all your time like alone in your cloister praying, you know, probably all kinds of ideas come to you. But there might be something that said, but like the idea of picking apart a concept and seeing what it really implies.
Yeah.
And I would say like there is something to like a priori reasoning. I would say like when you're thinking about like
A priori was.
a priori, yeah, this is like conceptual thinking.
Okay, yeah, good.
So I mean, there are certain things like people who have like say certain political ideologies, and they start thinking through like the contradictions in them, and they people change their mind because they say, well, on the one hand, you know, I think people should be able to make their own choices. On the other hand, I see the government throwing people in jail for smoking weed, and that just like, you know, and then you have people like flip on, say, the war on drugs, and they say, well, you know, as a conservative, I was like for the war on drugs, but on the other hand, I was slamming people for raising the smoking age to 21 and for banning trans fat, and I say, well, I have the right to put whatever I want in my own body. And then on the other hand, I was saying, you know, lock up not just the pot smokers, not in Oregon anymore, but, and, you know, people that do meth and stuff, to throw them in prison. And people eventually, they are often, not everyone, but people see like there's a contradiction between I have a right over, you know, what I put into my own body, and I don't want the government telling me what to do. and this idea of fighting this drug war. And also like privacy concerns and those things. And so people will flip, and often you get this progression of people from like kind of a conservative position to a more libertarian position based on this kind of conflict in the conservative ideology between government control and the war on drugs and try to impose religious moralism on people, and this also this ideology of freedom. Like Ronald Reagan said, the heart of conservatism is individual liberty. But he was like this big drug warrior. He had this war on porn. This is like before internet porn, right? And so you get like this heavy duty religious moralism using the state to impose puritanical religious standards, and also this war on drugs was really like a war on drug users, and really severe punishments and putting people in in prison for making and selling smut, and also for just like being a drug addict.